For over half a century, Buford Pusser's story stood as a classic American tale of one man's war on crime and a family's tragic sacrifice. The rural Tennessee road where his wife was slain in an alleged ambush became a symbol of both heroism and heartbreak. Hollywood turned his tale into the iconic movie Walking Tall, not once but twice, cementing Buford's legacy as a tough, no-nonsense sheriff who wouldn't back down. But in a shocking turn of events, nearly 6 decades later, investigators now say this folk hero lawman was likely the one who pulled the trigger the night his wife perished. Buford Pusser wasn't a typical small-town sheriff. Standing 6 feet 6 inches tall and built like the wrestler he once was, he cut an imposing figure from the moment he took office in McNairy County, Tennessee, in 1964. At just 27 years old, the youngest sheriff in Tennessee's history, he wasted no time cleaning up his county. He quickly earned a reputation for cracking down on moonshine, gambling parlors, and other vices along the Mississippi-Tennessee state line. According to the official narrative, he waged what locals called a one-man war on vice. By one count, he shut down 87 illegal whiskey stills in a single year, directly striking at the profits of local crime syndicates. Groups like the State Line Mob and the Dixie Mafia soon learned that the towering young sheriff would not go easy on them. In the span of a few years, Buford survived over a dozen attempts on his life. Nothing, it seemed, could sway this determined lawman from walking tall in the face of danger. In the pre-dawn hours of August 12, 1967, tragedy struck Buford's family and transformed his legend. According to the account Buford gave at the time, he received a call about a disturbance on a rural road. Despite the early hour, his wife Pauline insisted on accompanying him on the response. As their car passed a church, a second vehicle suddenly roared up alongside them and opened fire into the lawman's car. A storm of lead sprayed through the windshield and windows. Pauline was hit in the head and perished, while Big Buford himself was struck in the face, shattering his jaw. Bleeding and in shock, the sheriff managed to drive away from the attackers before crashing. When help arrived, Pauline was beyond saving, and Buford was barely clinging to life. He spent 18 days in the hospital and underwent multiple surgeries to reconstruct his damaged face. The community was horrified by the brazen attack, and by the official telling, it was a very direct attempt on the life of the sheriff by the very criminals he'd been tirelessly fighting. Buford's version of the ambush quickly became the official story. Even as he recuperated from his wounds, the grieving sheriff vowed to hunt down the people responsible for Pauline's slaying and bring them to justice. He told investigators that he recognized at least some of the assailants. In particular, Buford named a notorious Dixie Mafia figure, Kirksey Nix, as the likely mastermind behind the attack. Though no arrests were ever made, the narrative was clear. Buford's relentless war on organized crime had provoked vicious enemies to strike back at him in the most personal way. The case was effectively closed in 1967, built largely on Buford Pusser's own statement of events and his reputation as an incorruptible officer. In the public eye, Big Bad Buford emerged not only as a fearless crime fighter, but now also as a tragic hero who had paid a terrible price for his bravery. After Pauline's funeral, Buford returned to duty scarred but undeterred, with a new personal mission: to avenge his wife's passing, even if it meant using extrajudicial means. In the years that followed, he reportedly pursued the matter on his own terms. Officially, the investigation into the ambush went cold for lack of evidence, but stories swirled that might have taken justice into his own hands. One by one, several of the men he accused of involvement in the ambush met violent ends. In 1969, An accused Dixie Mob hitman named Carl White was brutally eliminated, and rumors quickly swirled that Buford had secretly arranged the event. Within a year, two more suspects, George McGann and Gary McDaniel, were also found deceased under mysterious circumstances in Texas. Though never proven, many locals believed that these deaths were no coincidence, and that Sheriff Pusser had orchestrated a fierce private vendetta to eliminate anyone involved in the event. Buford himself never admitted any such vigilantism, but he notably never dispelled the rumors either. In the absence of official convictions, the legend took hold that Buford had delivered his own form of justice from the shadows. Whether or not Buford directly ordered any reprisals, the effect was the same. His already formidable reputation grew to near mythic proportions. Here was a lawman who not only survived, but might have personally seen to it that those responsible paid the ultimate price. On the national stage, Buford's heroism was sealed by Hollywood. The 1973 film Walking Tall, loosely based on his life, turned Buford into a household name, and that film is of course why many of you knew who I was talking about immediately. Actor Joe Don Baker portrayed a character modeled on Buford, a towering, club-wielding sheriff determined to uproot organized crime in his town. Walking Tall became a hit and an enduring cult classic, spawning two sequels in the 1970s and a remake decades later, featuring The Rock, of all people, as a version of Buford. Notably, Buford had just signed a deal to play himself in a Walking Tall sequel when, in 1974, he passed away in a fiery single-car accident at age 36. His sudden death fueled yet another layer of mystique, with some of his loved ones suspecting that his old enemies had sabotaged his Corvette in revenge. By the mid-1970s, the legend of Buford Pusser seemed complete. He was remembered as the valiant sheriff who walked tall, cleaned up his town, and sacrificed more than most men ever would or could. He was a Wyatt Earp for the mid-20th century, a lawman who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty to pursue his own form of justice. For decades, nobody seriously questioned the story of Pauline's passing, and this event achieved folkloric status in Tennessee. But as time passed, whispers and doubts endured beneath the surface. In 2022, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation quietly decided to take a fresh look at the case as part of a routine cold case review. In January 2024, the TBI even publicized that Pauline's investigation was still active and asked the public for any new information or tips. One crucial discovery was that no autopsy had ever been performed on Pauline back in 1967, a startling oversight that investigators promptly set out to correct. With her family's consent, Pauline's body was exhumed in February 2024 so that a modern forensic examination could finally be conducted. Agents also received a tip about a potential weapon that had been overlooked, providing a fresh lead that investigators pursued as they re-examined the physical evidence. What they discovered would upend the traditional narrative, at least according to the district attorney. In August 2025, Tennessee authorities announced that new evidence implicated none other than Buford himself in the slaying of his wife. After the 3-year investigation, the local district attorney declared that if Buford were alive today, there was enough proof to present an indictment against him. This bombshell finding suggested that the infamous ambush was an elaborate cover-up staged by Buford to conceal his own act of violence. The reopened case uncovered several major inconsistencies in Buford's 1967 account. Modern forensic analysis, aided by the exhumation of Pauline's body, painted a very different picture of the crime scene from the one Buford had described. Notably, Pauline was most likely shot outside of the car, not inside it as the sheriff had long claimed. Her body, investigators believe, was then placed in the car afterward, to stage the appearance of a drive-by ambush. Photographs from 1967 showed blood spatter on the car's hood and on the ground that didn't line up with the story of an unknown attacker firing into the vehicle. Even more damning, the wound that Buford sustained to his face appeared to likely be a close contact shot. In short, the forensic evidence pointed to the conclusion that Buford shot his wife at close range and then took drastic steps to make the ambush story more believable. Digging into the couple's history also revealed disturbing context that had been glossed over in the hero narrative. Investigators found signs that Pauline had been a victim of violence before her slaying. Indeed, the new autopsy revealed that she had sustained a broken nose sometime prior to the attack, an injury that had healed by the time of her passing. This finding potentially corroborated long-standing whispers that Pauline's marriage had been troubled, though the exact cause of the break couldn't be confirmed. Law enforcement officials in 2025 were mindful of how shocking this revelation would be to those who grew up idolizing Buford Pusser. At a press conference announcing the findings, the district attorney even acknowledged that many officers had chosen careers in policing because of the walking tall legend. However, he emphasized that the priority was giving dignity to Pauline's family and ensuring that the truth was not buried by time. The TBI, for its part, has pledged transparency and claims they will release the entire cold case file to the public to prove their point. Personally, this is one of those cases where I'm not sure this sort of action would have been taken if Buford was alive. The problem is that if they did get it right, they did so with the evidence in the cold case file, and that means that the initial investigation was so badly botched as to be unreliable. If none of the basic forensic evidence lines up with Buford's contemporary story, then it makes me question whether there was something much bigger going on here. Further, proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt would be incredibly difficult given those initial screw-ups. Personally, I think on a balance of probabilities, the civil standard of proof, Buford would potentially be judged responsible for his wife's passing. The exhumation of Pauline's body revealed forensic inconsistencies with his 1967 ambush account. Blood patterns, bullet trajectories, and the apparent staging of her body all suggest she was shot outside the vehicle rather than inside during a drive-by. His own facial wound, once thought to be a graze from an attacker, aligns more with a close contact shot inflicted at short range, at least if the forensics are accepted. Notably, since Buford isn't alive to defend himself, he can't go and hire a countervailing expert to potentially give an entirely different take. When weighed collectively, these findings, if accepted as true, tip the scale toward a conclusion that Buford orchestrated the scene. In civil proceedings, where jurors or a judge need only be convinced that something is more likely than not, such physical evidence and his history of violence would probably secure liability. However, proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the criminal standard, would be far more difficult. Nearly 6 decades have passed, and many witnesses are deceased. No weapon was conclusively tied to him, and no eyewitness exists to directly contradict his original story. Reasonable doubt could be raised by the possibility of flawed or degraded forensic evidence, and the alternative suspects named at the time. While persuasive, the case remains circumstantial, making a criminal conviction much less than certain. Therefore, if he was alive, he may have ended up in a situation like O.J. Simpson, who was acquitted criminally, but found liable in civil court. Also, full disclosure, I saw Walking Tall when I was a kid, and up until this time had fully bought into the mythos of Buford as a badass American lawman. Hey everyone, Jimmy here as usual with a big shout out to all subscribers, YouTube members, and patrons. Also check out the Lazy Chill History video podcast, where I'm currently rolling out the content from my history channel. I've included the link in the description, so feel free to drop in over there and leave a comment and follow me there too. A 3-year-old girl stood crying on the stairs, locked out of her home, while unimaginable violence unfolded below. It was the afternoon of February 19th, 1982, in a quiet Woonsocket, Rhode Island apartment house, when a neighbor opened the basement door to a nightmare. Blood was spattered across the laundry room walls. 22-year-old Doreen Picard lay slumped between a washer and dryer, bludgeoned beyond recognition, and strangled with her own sweater. Nearby, 27-year-old Susan Lefert was barely alive in a pool of blood. Susan miraculously survived after hours of surgery, but she emerged from her coma with total amnesia about the attack. With Susan unable to remember the attack and a toddler the only other witness, detectives had little to go on in 1982. The perpetrator had left behind a bloodied 28-inch pipe in the basement, but no fingerprints could be lifted from it. Investigators could not discern a clear motive. Susan was a housewife, and Doreen a young student, neither with any known enemies or dark secrets that might invite such violence. Detectives were struck by the ferocity of the crime, and early theories ranged widely. The attacker could have been a stranger responding to a classified ad, since Lefert had advertised puppies for sale. Doreen's distraught family began their own inquiries and pressed authorities not to give up. Doreen's father even received an anonymous phone call warning him to stop pursuing the case, a chilling sign that someone was nervous about the family's search for the truth. But despite their persistence, months turned into years with no arrest. The case slowly went cold, and the community remained on edge knowing a predator was still at large. The long-dormant case gained new momentum after a 1988 feature on Unsolved Mysteries, which brought in fresh tips. I feel like this show needs no introduction, but if you're not familiar with it, it showcased unsolved crimes and other mysteries. In 1990, a crucial lead finally emerged. A local man, 36-year-old Daniel Shaw, came forward and implicated his friend Beaver Tempest in the crime. Tempest, a 37-year-old truck driver, was a friend of the Lafert family and had visited the house that day to pick up a pit bull puppy they offered him. Tempest had been on police radar since 1982, but there was never enough evidence to charge him until these new witnesses emerged. There were even rumors that Tempest had been having an affair with Susan, a situation that could have led to a heated confrontation in the basement. In June 1991, Tempest was finally indicted for Doreen Picard's slaying, nearly a decade after the crime, and the case went to trial the following year. At trial, Rhode Island prosecutors laid out a dramatic narrative of jealousy and rage. They argued that Tempest got into a violent argument with Susan in the basement, and then fatally attacked Doreen when she unwittingly walked in on the scene. According to this theory, he strangled Doreen with her own sweater and bludgeoned both women with a metal pipe before fleeing. It was a compelling story, but it lacked any physical evidence, and nothing at the scene tied Tempest to the crime. Instead, the prosecution's case hinged on a handful of acquaintances who claimed that, in the years following the attack, Tempest had privately confessed to them. These witnesses had checkered histories involving significant criminal activities, calling their credibility into question. One witness even claimed Tempest bragged that he would get away with it because he had family members in law enforcement. Still, taken together, the testimony of these individuals painted Tempest as a man who had boasted about committing the crime. In April 1992, the jury found Beaver Tempest guilty in Doreen Picard's demise. He was sentenced to 85 years in prison, but Tempest continued to insist he was innocent, even as he was led away in handcuffs. For many locals, the conviction brought relief that someone was held accountable, but others were uneasy with how it was obtained. The Tempest family's deep ties to law enforcement fueled debate. Raymond's late father had been a highly placed Woonsocket police official, and his brother, Gordon Tempest, was a sergeant in the department who took part in the early investigation. Some thought the family's connections had helped Raymond evade suspicion, while others believed internal police rivalries had made him a target. In a startling twist after the trial, Gordon Tempest was convicted in 1993 of perjury for lying under oath about aspects of another case. The sight of a police officer, the defendant's own brother, being punished for lying about evidence added to the doubt surrounding the investigation. This fact seemed to seal the idea that Beaver had done it, and his corrupt family had covered for him. This, of course, matched the narrative that Tempest himself allegedly had spun up. For the next 2 decades, Beaver Tempest pursued every legal avenue to prove he had been wrongfully convicted. Eventually, the New England Innocence Project took up Tempest's case. They re-examined the old evidence and uncovered stunning new information. For example, one key witness had initially given a statement that contradicted her trial testimony. Inconsistencies the state never revealed to the defense. They also discovered that the detective's original informant was a man with a personal grudge against the Tempest family, and that fact was never shared with the defense either. Investigators had even coached the witnesses on what to say, gently reminding them, repeatedly, that Beaver Tempest had confessed to the crime. Piece by piece, Tempest's team built the case that his 1992 conviction was founded on unreliable, manipulated evidence. In 2015, Tempest's lawyers filed for post-conviction relief. A Rhode Island Superior Court judge agreed that the original trial was flawed to the point that Beaver Tempest was denied his constitutional right to a fair trial. In July 2015, he vacated Tempest's conviction, ruling that prosecutors had withheld exculpatory evidence. After spending 23 years in prison, Tempest was released on bail that fall, awaiting a new trial. The next year, 2016, the Rhode Island Supreme Court upheld the decision, affirming that Tempest's conviction couldn't stand given the misconduct and new evidence. For the first time in over 2 decades, Tempest was out from behind bars, at least for the time being. Even after the courts overturned the conviction, state prosecutors were reluctant to let the case go. They initially announced plans to retry Tempest for the slaying of Doreen Pickard. By then, the evidence against him had been severely undermined, and memories had faded. Rather than risk a second trial and a possible life sentence, Tempest made a consequential choice. In December 2017, he entered an Alford plea, a legal mechanism whereby a defendant doesn't admit guilt, but acknowledges that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict. In exchange, he received a sentence of time served. This meant that, with the decades he had already spent behind bars, Tempest would serve no further prison time. He walked out of court a free man, still proclaiming his innocence, even if he had to legally say there was evidence to convict him. And just to put this in perspective, he faced 2 choices: to either take the Alford plea and get released immediately, or to roll the dice with the rest of his life after decades in prison. If he is indeed innocent, despite the Alford plea, then that must have been a hell of a difficult decision to make. Ultimately, it remains unclear what really happened to Doreen and Susan that day in February. The case is officially closed, and Beaver Tempest has officially been convicted of the crime. Unfortunately, this is a case where a botched investigation has prevented true justice from being served in any event. If Beaver did it, he's now out free when he should still be behind bars for the attacks. If he's innocent, Beaver now has this millstone around his neck for the rest of his life, and the guy who actually did it could still be walking free, knowing he got away with it completely. Imagine you learned that your life, every single moment, from your greatest triumphs to your most mundane days, will happen again and again, exactly the same way, forever. No changes, no edits, just an infinite rerun of everything you have experienced. This mind-bending question might sound like science fiction, but it lies at the heart of a profound philosophical idea. The concept of eternal recurrence proposes that time is not a one-way street, but a circle, that all events may repeat themselves in an endless loop. It's an idea that has captivated thinkers for millennia, with many cultures even symbolizing it through the Ouroboros, a snake swallowing its tail, as a sign of eternal cycles. The notion that time could be cyclical has deep roots in human thought. Indeed, long before modern storytellers toyed with time loops, ancient philosophers and religious traditions imagined the universe as an endless cycle. For example, Pythagorean thinkers in ancient Greece believed in the transmigration of souls, a form of reincarnation where souls are reborn over and over in different bodies. In Eastern philosophies like Buddhism, the wheel of time turns endlessly. The cosmos undergoes infinite cycles of creation and destruction, and living beings are caught in samsara, the repeating cycle of birth and rebirth. Even outside of spiritual contexts, early Greek thinkers noted circular patterns in nature and history. Aristotle described time itself as a circle, with seasons repeated in a reassuring rhythm year after year. Greek philosophers like Empedocles even imagined cosmic history as an endless cycle of elemental forces coming together and breaking apart, only to repeat forever. These ideas were, in essence, borrowing the idea that seasonality also applies to the entirety of the cosmic order itself. One school that took the idea of cosmic repetition seriously was the Stoics of ancient Greece and Rome. The Stoic philosophers proposed that the universe unfolds in recurring epochs. Some Stoics even went so far as to argue that in each new cycle, everything repeats exactly in the same sequence. Such cyclical ideas stood in stark contrast to the later linear view of time promoted by Christianity, which saw history as a one-way journey with a clear beginning and end. As the influence of Christianity grew, these ancient notions of eternal cycles became less prominent in Western thought. However, the fascination with cosmic loops never completely disappeared. Even modern cosmologists explored the idea that the universe might undergo endless cycles of big bangs and big crunches. This hypothesis remains unproven, but it shows how strongly the idea of recurrence grips the imagination. In the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche famously revived the concept of eternal recurrence as a provocative thought experiment rather than a scientific theory. It was a daring move in an intellectual climate that assumed history was linear, unrepeatable, and always destined towards upward progress. Nietzsche asked the reader to imagine a striking scenario. A demon suddenly whispers that your life, exactly as you have lived it, will repeat itself innumerable times. Every joy and every sorrow, every trivial moment and every great triumph will recur again and again on the eternal carousel of existence. Nietzsche suggests two extreme reactions to this pronouncement. One is despair. You might curse the messenger and tremble at the idea of reliving every pain and regret endlessly. The other is delight. You might welcome the news, even proclaim you've never heard anything more divine. He didn't intend this morbid scenario as a literal description of the cosmos, but as a challenge to our attitude toward life. It forces each of us to ask, do I love my life enough that I would want to live it again, exactly the same? Nietzsche's aim was to provoke a life-affirming mindset. He wanted people to confront this hypothetical eternal return and respond with a resounding yes to life. To embrace eternal recurrence, then, means to embrace life so completely that even its hardships and sorrows are welcomed as part of the whole. Nietzsche argued joy came from being someone who could accept the prospect of living his or her same life on repeat and still rejoice in it. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the prophet Zarathustra eventually calls eternal recurrence a joyous truth, framing it as the ultimate test of saying yes to existence. Nietzsche even saw this idea as a counterpoint to religious hopes of an afterlife. Instead of longing for paradise in another realm, eternal recurrence offers a kind of immortality in this world, repeating forever. So we must learn to value this life fully. However, it's noteworthy that Nietzsche never outright claimed eternal recurrence was scientifically true. In private notes, he wondered about it, but in his published work, he treated it as a thought experiment and metaphor. The power of the idea is therefore psychological rather than physical. From a scientific perspective, eternal recurrence takes on a different flavor than in philosophy. If time and space are infinite, then the number of possible arrangements of matter is finite. Because even though the universe is vast, the laws of physics limit how particles can be organized. Over an infinite stretch of time, every possible configuration would eventually repeat. This is sometimes framed in terms of the Poincaré recurrence theorem, which states that under certain conditions, a system will eventually return to its original state. Cosmologists have extended this reasoning to the universe itself. If it's boundless and eternal, then the histories we experience could recur countless times. Some models of a cyclical cosmos suggest that universes are born, collapse, and are reborn endlessly, making repetition inevitable. In a more statistical sense, if there are infinitely many universes in a multiverse, then there are infinitely many versions of you living out the same life. Here, eternal recurrence isn't a mystical fate, but a logical outcome of infinite possibilities, playing out an infinite amount of times. It implies that our existence isn't unique, but one of endless reruns written into the mathematics of infinity. And again, much like Nietzsche's thought experiment, it suggests that we ought to live our best life, because it's the only life we have. In the end, if one accepts this theory, we can be cursed or blessed to live the one life we're forced to live an infinite amount of times. Imagine waking up in the dead of night to a strange sensation, not of pain or theft, but the eerie realization that someone had been in your bedroom and cut off a lock of your hair. It sounds like a campfire horror story, yet in 1942, the people of Pascagoula, Mississippi, lived this nightmare. An unknown prowler dubbed the Phantom Barber crept into homes at night and sheared off people's hair as they slept, disappearing into the darkness without a trace. Interestingly, there's credible evidence to suggest this weird occurrence was actually a psychological operation carried out by the Axis powers. In the early 1940s, Pascagoula was a town on edge even before the Phantom Barber arrived. The population had tripled almost overnight due to the boom at the local shipyard due to the global conflict that had engulfed the world. Although this boom brought economic growth, it also strained Pascagoula's small police force and led to more petty crimes in town, even before the Phantom attacks started. Blackout rules kept the city dim at night to prevent enemy attacks, cloaking neighborhoods in near-total darkness each night. War paranoia ran high, with German U-boats reportedly lurking in the Gulf of Mexico. People suspected that any neighbor or newcomer could be an enemy spy. In this tense atmosphere, the sudden string of hair-snipping break-ins sent Pascagoula into full-blown panic. The first reported incident came around midnight on June 5, 1942, at the Our Lady of Victory's convent. Two girls, 11-year-old Mary Evelyn Briggs and 12-year-old Edna Marie Heidel, awoke to see a shadowy man. One girl later described him as a short, stocky figure in a light-colored sweatshirt, and the girl's screams rang out, but the intruder had already vanished. Each girl found a chunk of her hair had been neatly clipped off, and the two youngsters were both shaken and stirred, but otherwise unharmed. Just a few days later, the phantom barber struck again. This time the target was 6-year-old Carol Petty, who was asleep in her bedroom across town on a Monday night. The intruder cut open the window screen and crept in while Carol and her twin brother slept. By morning, Carol's lovely blonde curls had been cruelly shorn. Her brother, beside her, didn't appear to have any of his hair taken. The bold prowler once again vanished without seriously harming anyone, taking only stolen locks of hair. At the Petty home, investigators did find one clue: a sandy footprint on a chair beneath the window, suggesting the culprit had stood there to enter and exit. The community was alarmed and baffled, and law enforcement was stumped. The police chief admitted he couldn't imagine what would drive a person to commit such bizarre break-ins. Aside from the cut window screens and an occasional footprint, the phantom left little trace. All the targets so far were young and female, which led parents to dread that their own daughters might be next. Many residents began sealing their windows shut despite the summer heat. Then the pattern shifted dramatically. In mid-June, the intruder invaded the bedroom of the Heidelbergs, a local couple, and attacked them with an iron bar. Both survived, but the violent assault marked a dangerous escalation from the earlier hair thefts. Some in town questioned if this was even the same perpetrator, since nothing was stolen, not even hair, and the brutality was unprecedented. Nevertheless, police believed the phantom barber had turned violent. The very next week, a final incident seemed to confirm the barber's evolving tactics. A woman named Miss Taylor woke feeling a nauseating smell, and later discovered a portion of her hair had been cut off while she was unconscious. Investigators suspected the intruder used an anesthetic to keep her asleep while he took her hair. It was another brazen break-in and assault, though fortunately Miss Taylor was not otherwise harmed. For several weeks that summer, Pascagoula felt under siege by an invisible menace. With a prowler literally cutting hair off people's heads, everyday life took a surreal turn. Men refused to leave home for night shifts at the shipyard, insisting on guarding their families, causing significant delays in building ships for the fight against the Axis. Nearly every able-bodied man armed himself and joined in local neighborhood watch groups, again leading to diminished output at the local factories. The authorities publicly promised that they would have the case fully wrapped up by July 1942 and deployed all their resources to catching the phantom. In a rare move, the Army relaxed the town's nighttime blackout restrictions to shed a bit of light on the streets, hoping to make it harder for the prowler to hide. Despite these efforts, July 1942 arrived with no arrests and no new leads. The phantom barber seemed impossible to catch. To make matters stranger, a rash of other nighttime intrusions was reported nearby. In those incidents, the prowler did not cut hair at all, but would slice open window screens and scatter clothing and dishes around the homes. Whether this was the phantom barber indulging in further mischief or a copycat playing pranks, nobody could say. Finally, in August 1942, the case took a turn, which suggested that this whole string of incidents may have been something even more sinister. Police arrested 57-year-old William A. Dolan, a chemist who had studied in Germany, and accused him of being the phantom barber. He was initially brought in due to his feud with the Heidelbergs, the couple who had been viciously attacked, and the authorities wasted no time pinning the scare on Dolan. The police chief speculated that Dolan's goal in the haircutting spree was to impair the morale of workers, effectively accusing him of being a saboteur on behalf of the Germans. Notably, neighbors whispered that Dolan had very strong pro-German sympathies. The narrative quickly formed that this disgruntled, German-educated chemist had terrorized Pascagoula as the Phantom Barber. Dolan was formally charged, not with the hair snippings, but with the attack on the Heidelbergs. That was the most serious offense, and the one charge authorities felt confident would stick, and his trial was swift. Fueled by the community's palpable relief and anger, the jury took only a few hours to convict Dolan of the assault, and the judge handed down a 10-year prison sentence. At last, Pascagoula could sleep peacefully again, convinced that the nightmare was over. For the first time in months, residents let their guard down, believing the Phantom was safely behind bars. Years later, doubts began to surface about whether Dolan was really the Phantom Barber. He always insisted he was innocent, and in 1948 he even passed a lie detector test arranged by the state governor, though of course those aren't exactly a science. Citing the ambiguous evidence and public hysteria surrounding the case, the governor granted Dolan an early release, and he was eventually pardoned entirely. The case of the Phantom Barber thus remains technically unsolved, and there are some serious questions floating about the attacks in general. While the question of whether Dolan was responsible for any or all of the attacks remains unsolved, the most interesting question is whether a saboteur was at play. The prevailing wartime theory was that a German agent or sympathizer carried out the attacks to undermine local industrial production through fear. The Phantom Barber's timing and effect, causing skilled workers to stay home, did hurt the shipyard output, lending some credence to this idea. Although no direct proof of spy activity was found, this idea made sense to many frightened residents in 1942. Some have speculated that if it was discovered that German agents were at play, this information wouldn't have been released to the public. Americans were already worried about foreign agents disrupting factory production, and confirmation that this really happened would have caused even more disruption. However, after relations with Germany and the United States normalized, there was no indication that sabotage took place in Pascagoula. That said, it's always possible that the records related to any such psychological operation were destroyed, or that the people responsible either weren't alive or weren't talking. Interestingly, some have speculated that aside from the attack on the Heidelbergs, that the entirety of the incident could be chalked up to mass hysteria. Under this theory, the Phantom Barber never actually existed, and was simply a manifestation of the fear and anxiety felt on the home front during the conflict. Ultimately, whether a German agent or sympathizer carried out the attacks to disrupt industrial output will continue to remain an unsolved mystery. A disposable camera found on a lonely mountain trail held a haunting secret. Its final photograph, snapped in darkness, revealed only a boy's frightened eyes and nose. This eerie self-portrait is the last trace of 12-year-old Jared Negrete, who vanished during a Boy Scout hike in 1991. His disappearance has baffled searchers for decades and remains one of Southern California's most unsettling wilderness mysteries. In July 1991, Jared Negrete, a shy but friendly 12-year-old from El Monte, went on his first overnight Boy Scout camping trip. The journey began on July 18th with the troop camping overnight. By the next day, as they pushed toward the 11,500-foot summit, Jared struggled to keep up on the steep switchback trails, and he eventually fell behind the others. Rather than halt the group's progress, the troop leader decided the faster hikers would continue to the summit and pick up Jared on their way back down. Thus, Jared was left walking at his own pace alone on the mountainside as evening neared. This is, of course, an extremely questionable and disturbing decision in and of itself, having the leader of the expedition leaving behind one of the most vulnerable members. In hindsight, if this hadn't have happened, this nightmare would have almost certainly been avoided. Some hikers later reported seeing the lone boy cutting straight down the switchbacks, and they urged him to stay on the marked trail. In fact, around 6 o'clock, one off-duty firefighter hiking through encountered Jared and warned him not to stray off route, and that was the last confirmed sighting of the boy. When the troop regrouped on the descent that night, Jared was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, the leader led the other boys back to base camp and then hiked down the mountain in darkness to summon help. By the time authorities were notified, Jared had already been missing for several hours in the vast wilderness. At first light on July 20th, 1991, an intensive search and rescue operation was launched. Teams of rescuers scoured the mountainside on foot and horseback, while helicopters swept the area from above. Rescuers came from across Southern California, and they searched day and night in rotating shifts. The terrain was unforgiving. Loose rocks, slippery slopes, and dense brush made every step perilous. Mount San Gorgonio's wilderness is a maze of rocky crags and sandy switchbacks, with many trails that lead to nowhere, making navigation difficult even for experienced hikers. Off the established paths, one can easily be swept into a ravine or end up obscured by thick vegetation in this treacherous region. Despite the dangers, officials held on to hope because summer weather was mild and fresh water was available from streams. Within 2 days, searchers found their first clues. On July 21st, footprints believed to match Jared's sneakers were spotted around the 10,000-foot level of the mountain. This discovery helped narrow the focus to a specific zone of the wilderness. Shortly afterward, search teams discovered pieces of beef jerky and some candy wrappers likely dropped by Jared during his hike. A week into the effort, on July 27th, the most significant find was made: Jared's disposable Kodak camera, lying about 50 feet off the Vivian Creek Trail. When the film was developed, investigators found 12 photos. Most were scenic shots taken before Jared went missing, but the final frame was a startling enigma. It was a blurry, extreme close-up of Jared's face, just his eyes and nose, taken at night with the camera's flash. At some point after his disappearance, the boy had pointed the camera at himself and snapped a picture in the dark. Family members who later saw this last photo believed that Jared looked frightened in it, giving a chilling glimpse of his ordeal on the mountainside. With these clues in hand, authorities concentrated their efforts below the spot where Jared was last seen. Dozens of searchers combed through creek beds, thickets, and rocky drop-offs in that area inch by inch. At one point, a blue water bottle was found and briefly raised hopes, but it was confirmed not to have belonged to Jared. Over the next 2 weeks, the operation grew into the largest search in San Bernardino County history. As many as 3,000 people in total participated, covering up to 50 square miles of wilderness in their exhaustive hunt. Volunteers, sheriff's deputies, forest rangers, and National Guard troops all joined forces in the massive effort. Jared's mother, Linda, hiked into the search area alongside authorities, determined to help find any sign of her son. Yet, despite clear weather and an all-out push, not a single additional trace of the boy emerged. After 16 days of exhaustive searching, officials made the painful decision to call off the official search on August 4th, 1991. By then, the chance of finding Jared alive was deemed virtually zero, and authorities had to presume the boy had perished. Veteran rescuers remarked in contemporary interviews with the LA Times that hikers often get lost in these mountains, but rarely do they disappear without a trace. In Jared's case, sadly, that is exactly what happened. He was simply gone, leaving his family and searchers with nothing to do but wonder how and why. In the absence of a definitive answer, several theories have been put forward to explain his disappearance. Investigators and family members have pondered these possibilities, but without new evidence, none can be confirmed. The most widely accepted theory is that Jared fell victim to the mountain's perilous terrain. All signs suggest he left the main trail and ventured into an unsafe area while trying to find his way down alone. If he slipped on loose rocks or stepped over a ledge in the fading light, he could have tumbled into a hidden ravine or crag. From there, the dense brush and jagged terrain might easily have concealed him from rescuers. The wilderness has many sheer cliffs and deep gullies blanketed with vegetation, and searchers noted that a person could quickly become invisible if they wandered off the path. Some involved in the search speculated that Jared appeared to have attempted continued shortcutting down the switchbacks until he ended up below the established trail. This would have involved descending into a difficult canyon, which was the same canyon where his camera and candy wrappers were found. Under such conditions, it's very plausible that Jared fell or became injured and couldn't climb out. The fact that no remains or clothing were ever found is unsettling, but it could be due to the vastness of the area and how thoroughly nature can hide a body. This accidental misadventure scenario remains the leading explanation in the eyes of those who have studied the case. Another angle considered whether someone else could have been involved in Jared's fate. From the start, investigators found no evidence of human interference, and there were no signs of a struggle, no suspicious footprints or items, and no eyewitness reports. While not entirely impossible, an abduction in that remote setting would have been difficult to pull off without alerting other hikers nearby. However, one theory suggested that perhaps Jared wandered down to a road and was picked up by an unknown individual, essentially kidnapped after surviving the initial night. This idea was investigated, but authorities eventually largely dismissed it for lack of any corroborating clues or sightings. In the end, nothing concrete ever emerged to point toward foul play. Law enforcement's consensus has long been that Jared's disappearance was most likely a tragic accident, not the work of another person. That said, while the authorities view this as a very unlikely scenario, it remains a potential possibility. Notably, because the region is home to wildlife like black bears and mountain lions, the possibility of an animal attack was also examined. However, this theory was quickly deemed unlikely. Search teams found no evidence to indicate a bear or cougar had attacked and dragged Jared away. Encounters with large predators are rare, and they almost always leave obvious signs when they do occur. Since absolutely no such traces were found during the extensive search, the wildlife theory holds little weight compared to other explanations. Jared's disappearance devastated his family and community. In September 1991, after hope of finding him alive had faded, the family held a memorial service in his honor. To this day, no trace of Jared Negrete has ever been recovered, and the case remains cold, despite being periodically re-examined by the authorities. And yeah, just before we move on, this story is incredibly messed up, because there's absolutely no reason this should have happened to Jared. And I don't say that to imply that bad things should happen to anyone I'm covering, but to say that this tragedy was both 100% preventable and also completely foreseeable. Leaving behind the least physically capable member of the hike just so you can reach the summit is incredibly messed up, to say the least. In the spring of 2007, a seasoned adventurer set out into the wilds of northern Arizona and never came back. Reinhard Kirchner was a 61-year-old physicist from Germany who loved exploring the rugged landscapes of the American Southwest. An experienced hiker in excellent shape, he had journeyed to the United States many times to trek through its deserts and canyons. This trip was supposed to be another grand adventure, but instead, it became a haunting mystery. Kirchner ventured into a remote area of the Navajo Reservation, a place of deep canyons, hidden sinkholes, and unforgiving terrain, and simply vanished without a trace. Reinhard Kirchner wasn't a novice in the wilderness. Back home in Germany, he had a distinguished career as a physicist, but his passion for adventure often drew him overseas. He had fallen in love with the dramatic geology of Arizona's Colorado Plateau, returning again and again to hike its trails and photograph its vistas. Friends and family knew him as a fit, careful, and well-prepared outdoorsman. By 2007, he had extensive experience in desert hiking and canyon exploration, and he even knew this particular region well from prior visits. Kirchner's personal life was also in a good place. He was engaged to be married and was planning to meet his fiancée in Las Vegas after his hiking trip. That rendezvous was set for April 9th, 2007, but unfortunately, he would never make it to that meeting. In early April 2007, Kirchner drove his rented pickup truck deep into a remote section of the Navajo wilderness in northeastern Arizona. He was heading for an area near a dramatic bend of the Little Colorado River, known as Hellhole Bend. This region of the Colorado Plateau is characterized by sheer cliffs that plummet into a 2,500-foot gorge and a landscape riddled with hidden sinkholes. In fact, Hellhole Bend earned its ominous name from the abundance of these hellish sinkhole pits in the ground. It is the kind of place only the most adventurous hikers would go, and Kirchner was certainly one of them. He parked his truck near the canyon's rim and set off on foot, likely for a day hike. When April 9th came and Kirchner failed to show up in Las Vegas to meet his fiancée, alarm bells rang. At first, those close to him wondered if he might have been delayed or out of cell phone range, but as the days passed with no word, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Kirchner was reliable and kept to his plans, and for him to miss that meeting without any contact meant he was in trouble. His fiancée reported him missing, and authorities sprang into action. On April 12, 2007, searchers located Kirchner's abandoned rental truck near the rim of the Little Colorado River Gorge, about 2 miles from Hellhole. The truck sat on a lonely dirt track by the canyon, a silent marker of where he had begun his trek. There were no signs of foul play or any potential theft at the site, and it appeared that Kirchner had simply walked off into the wild and never come back. Finding Kirchner's truck triggered an intensive multi-agency search effort across jurisdictional lines, with both county and tribal authorities joining in. Coconino County Sheriff's search and rescue teams and Navajo Nation officials joined forces to scour the canyon lands by land and air. Helicopters crisscrossed the maze of cliffs and ravines, while ground teams and dog units struggled through the rocky, uneven terrain below. Over 6 days, searchers covered approximately 60 square miles around Hellhole Bend. This was no small feat, as the landscape is formidable at best and extremely problematic at worst. The gorge of the Little Colorado River cuts deep into the plateau, and one misstep near the edge can be deadly. Rescuers had to be extremely cautious not to become victims themselves. One of the biggest hazards in this area, and a possible key to Kirchner's fate, is the presence of numerous limestone sinkholes. These are deep natural pits in the ground, often concealed by desert scrub and hard to see until it's too late. Especially after dusk, It's perilously easy to stumble into one of these chasms without warning. Search coordinators noted that many of the sinkholes near Hellhole Bend were too dangerous to enter, so they lowered cameras in hopes of spotting any trace of the missing man. Despite these efforts, the search turned up nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not the hiking stick or camera that Kirchner was known to carry. After nearly a week of exhaustive effort, the official search was reluctantly called off with no evidence found. With no solid evidence to go on, those involved in the case have been left to speculate how an experienced hiker could disappear so completely. The leading theory is that Kirchner suffered an accident in the wilderness. Given the known dangers in the area, many believe he likely fell into a hidden sinkhole or over a cliff near the canyon rim. A fall from such heights or into a deep pit would be catastrophic, and it might explain why searchers found no remains. If Kirchner's body ended up at the bottom of an unseen chasm, it could remain undiscovered despite all the search efforts. The area is so remote and seldom visited that it's possible no one has yet come across any sign of him. Another possibility is that Kirchner became lost or injured and eventually succumbed to the elements. April nights in this high desert are deceptively cold, and the days can be extremely hot. A dangerous combination if you're stranded without shelter or water. Kirchner had only a day pack with him and was not equipped for a long ordeal in the wild. If he wandered beyond the initial search zone or got trapped in one of the side canyons, he might have been missed. Still, the complete lack of clues, such as a campsite or gear, makes this scenario less convincing. Foul play is an unlikely scenario but can't be entirely ruled out. The location is extremely isolated, and encountering a wrongdoer out there would be rare. Investigators found no evidence pointing to robbery or violence. His vehicle and belongings were undisturbed. All signs point more toward a tragic mishap than a crime in this case. Although investigators view Reinhard Kirchner's fate as a tragic hiking accident, some in the public have speculated about whether his disappearance is related to his profession. Kirchner was a physicist in Germany, a field that often involves sensitive research projects. While there's no evidence suggesting that he was working on classified or high-security projects, the mystery of his vanishing has encouraged such theories. Some suggest he could have been silenced because of knowledge he possessed. Others have proposed that he may have chosen to disappear deliberately to escape professional pressures. It's really important here to emphasize that these ideas remain highly speculative, with no proof connecting his physics career to his disappearance in Arizona. Still, the combination of his scientific expertise and the total lack of physical evidence has allowed these theories to persist in discussions of his case. While Reinhard Kirchner's disappearance is clearly both tragic and sad, I don't see it as a particularly dark tale like some have suggested. The most consistent and credible explanation for Kirchner's disappearance aligns with the official narrative: a tragic accident in an unforgiving landscape. Search teams noted the prevalence of those hidden sinkholes and sheer cliffs near Hellhole Bend, any of which could have claimed his life in an instant. With no signs of foul play and no evidence suggesting an intentional disappearance, the simplest answer is also the most logical. Kirchner was a seasoned outdoorsman, which some have used to argue that the case could be much darker, but even experts can be overwhelmed by the hazards of remote terrain. His case essentially illustrates how nature's unpredictability can overcome preparation and experience, especially in truly unforgiving terrain. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to like and subscribe. Also check out the Lazy Chill History video podcast, where I'm currently rolling out the content from my history channel. I've included the link in the description, so feel free to drop in over there and leave a comment and follow me there too. It was like a scene out of a movie. A wealthy investor under investigation sneaks onto a private jet, whisking himself out of the country just ahead of the law. The fugitive vanishes into a string of tropical hideouts, taunting authorities who can never quite catch him. Decades later, rumors swirl that even his death might have been an elaborate hoax. This isn't fiction, but the real story of Robert Vesco. He's a man whose name became synonymous with high-stakes financial crime and one of the most perplexing disappearing acts in modern history. Vesco's saga is a cocktail of distilled greed, high-stakes intrigue, and pure audacity. In the 1970s, he was wanted for bilking investors out of around $200 million, making illegal political payoffs, and plotting schemes reaching the White House. Yet what makes Vesco's tale truly extraordinary is not just the scale of his misdeeds, but how he evaded justice by slipping through the cracks of international law. For nearly 40 years, law enforcement hunted him across the globe while he lived in luxury, courting presidents and dictators in search of safe haven. In the end, he disappeared so completely that even confirming his passing became a mystery. If you look at the start of Robert Lee Vesco's life, you could have never guessed that he was destined to be a criminal mastermind. Born in 1935, he was a high school dropout who first worked on Detroit's assembly lines before finding his way into finance. As a teen, he had vowed to escape Detroit, run his own company, and become a millionaire. Ambitions he spectacularly achieved by his early 30s. By the age of 30, he had taken over a struggling machine tool company in New Jersey, turned it around, and renamed it International Controls Corporation. This meteoric rise made Vesco the young millionaire he had always dreamed of being, and if this is where it stopped, he may have been remembered as a successful business tycoon. But despite having pretty much whatever he wanted, his ambition soon veered into deeply unscrupulous territory. In 1970, he set his sights on a Geneva-based mutual fund empire called Investors Overseas Services, which was in deep trouble. Vesco swooped in and bought iOS for a mere $5 million, gaining control of an estimated $400 million of other people's money. The iOS accounting was so chaotic that, by adding a few subterfuges of his own, Vesco could plunder its holdings at will. Investigators later alleged that he hid the money via sham companies and even broke into a Swiss bank vault to seize shares. What followed was one of the largest financial scandals of the era. Once he had control, Vesco allegedly siphoned money out of the company through a maze of shell companies and deceptive bookkeeping. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission eventually charged that he stole more than $224 million from the iOS funds. These weren't funds owned by the company, to be clear. These were assets under management by the company itself. In essence, he had stolen other people's money on an extremely grand scale. By late 1972, the SEC filed a civil fraud suit against Vesco and his associates, accusing them of massive embezzlement. iOS soon collapsed, and investors eventually recovered only a fraction of their money. But by then, Vesco was long gone, and criminal charges loomed on the horizon. Facing imminent indictment, Vesco made a brazen move. In early 1973, rather than face justice, he fled the United States. According to later allegations, he loaded up his corporate jet with about $200 million of the looted assets, and took off to parts unknown. This dramatic escape marked the beginning of Robert Vesco's life as an international fugitive. Vesco's first stop was the Caribbean, a region that would serve as his sanctuary for years to come. He initially landed in the Bahamas and then settled in Costa Rica, which had no extradition treaty with the United States. In Costa Rica, Vesco lived lavishly and quickly moved to secure his safety. He courted President José Figueres by pouring money into local business ventures. reportedly investing millions into his adopted country's economy. His largesse paid off, and the Costa Rican legislature, influenced by the president, passed a law ensuring Vesco couldn't be extradited. José Figueres, facing criticism for harboring a fugitive, said Costa Rica would take money from anyone if it helped the country. With this legal shield in place, the fugitive financier openly enjoyed life in Costa Rica, while American prosecutors mauled helplessly on the sidelines. The audacity of Vesco's bribery didn't stop at small countries. Before fleeing the U.S., he had tried to use his wealth to halt the SEC investigation. Through a chain of intermediaries, he funneled a secret $200,000 contribution into President Richard Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. He had hoped the Nixon administration would quash the case against him and open him up to returning to the United States as a free man. That gambit failed, and two of Nixon's associates, John Mitchell and Maurice Stans, were indicted and later acquitted for obstructing justice in connection with the donation. Not content with meddling in one White House, Vesco later boasted of a scheme to bribe officials to lift sanctions on Libya. This event entangled President Jimmy Carter's brother in scandal. Still, from his tropical refuge, he showed how money could overcome ideology and borders. He befriended whoever could offer protection: democratically elected leaders, socialist revolutionaries, even narco kingpins. Simply put, he was cool with anyone who might help him stay out of American reach. Vesco's welcome in Costa Rica lasted until 1978. When Figueres left office and a new president took over, the government rescinded Vesco's special protections. Sensing the shift, Vesco slipped out of Costa Rica just before authorities could turn on him. Thus began an endless journey from one haven to the next. He resurfaced in the Bahamas, where he had cultivated ties to the Prime Minister and even Medellin cartel figures. He even tried to buy a small Caribbean island for himself at one point, but when that plan fell through, he kept up his itinerant lifestyle. Vesco traveled in style. At one point, he owned a private Boeing 707 jetliner outfitted with a bar and even a disco lounge. He spared no expense on mansions, yachts, and entertainment. But he knew that as a fugitive who hides in plain sight, he must constantly buy protection in each temporary refuge. Over the years, he burned through much of his stolen fortune doing just that. By the 1980s, his look had evolved from a boardroom executive to something out of Scarface. His slick suits gave way to sunglasses, open-collar shirts, and flashy sideburns. By the early 1980s, Vesco found refuge in Nicaragua, then governed by the Sandinistas. As with his prior hosts, he promised to invest and aid the economy, but no grand projects ever materialized, and he eventually moved on. In 1982, Cuba accepted Robert Vesco for humanitarian medical reasons, on the condition that he refrain from any financial mischief on their soil. Cuba had no extradition agreement with America, making it an ideal hideout, and for a time Vesco kept a low profile in Havana, living under the alias Tom Adams. Even Fidel Castro publicly said that Cuba didn't care about Vesco's past and wasn't interested in his money as long as he behaved. It was speculated at the time that Castro had simply let Vesco into Cuba for the sole reason of being a thorn in the side of the American authorities. It was, in essence, a small diplomatic and domestic propaganda win, hosting a man who was exiled from the United States. But for Vesco, old habits die hard, and despite Castro's conditions, he couldn't resist one more big scheme. In 1989, American prosecutors indicted him yet again, this time for smuggling, alleging that he had conspired with Medellin cartel traffickers. They alleged that he was working together with well-known Pablo Escobar associate and kingpin Carlos Later to ship Colombian confetti into the States. Also, just as a quick aside, when researching this, I found out that as of 2025, Carlos Later is a free man. I feel like I need to do a segment on him at some point in the future, but I digress. Safely entrenched in Cuba, Vesco shrugged off that American indictment, but a few years later he embarked on an even more bizarre venture that would ultimately be his undoing. In the early 1990s, he teamed up with a member of President Nixon's family and a rogue ex-CIA agent to promote a supposed miracle drug called TX. The pitch was straight out of a late-night infomercial. They claimed it could boost the immune system and eliminate literally any disease, and he was intent on selling this idea to the Cuban government. For a brief moment, Vesco reinvented himself as a biotech entrepreneur, even convincing Cuban authorities to let him conduct what I'll loosely call clinical trials. Reality caught up with Vesco in May 1995. The Cuban government discovered the wonder drug venture was a scam and promptly arrested Vesco. In 1996, he was convicted of fraud and illicit economic activities and sentenced to 13 years in a Cuban prison. The man who once hopped countries with impunity was now behind bars in the very nation that had given him his most permanent refuge. Vesco remained behind bars in Cuba for nearly a decade until he was finally released in 2005. In declining health and in his 70s, Vesco was quietly released to live out his final days under Cuban supervision. After decades of indulgence, he was a frail shadow of his former self, and for most people, this would be where the story ends. But for Vesco, one final twist in his saga was yet to come. The end of Robert Vesco's life is shrouded in uncertainty and rumor. According to multiple reports, Vesco died on November 23, 2007 in Havana at age 72, succumbing to lung cancer. In true Vesco fashion, news of his death was not announced by Cuban officials. It was only months later that journalists uncovered records of his burial and photographs suggesting his fate. A Havana cemetery log showed that a Robert Vesco was interred on that date, and images surfaced of an emaciated Vesco in a hospital bed and later in a coffin. These pointed to a quiet end for the fugitive financier. Yet many were not convinced, and his own former associates immediately suspected a hoax as Vesco had used disguises to escape in the past. Indeed, one of his closest confidants, a rogue CIA agent named Frank Turpil, flatly rejected the official story. Turpil claimed that his friend had slipped out of Cuba and was living secretly in Sierra Leone. According to this theory, the ailing old man in the photos was real, but the death was staged so Vesco could vanish under a new identity. And if anyone could manage that feat, it was definitely Vesco. Whether Robert Vesco truly perished in Cuba or slipped off the radar forever, his vanishing act stands as one of the most notorious in modern criminal history. He left behind a trail of ruined companies and lives. His journey, from working-class Detroit dropout to globe-trotting fugitive financier, is a story that's stranger than fiction. But that's not where the story ends, and Vesco's story gets even weirder, potentially at least. One of the most persistent theories about Robert Vesco's ability to elude capture for decades is that he may have been connected to American intelligence services. Critics point out that few fugitives managed to evade the combined pressure of the FBI, the Department of Justice, and other agencies for as long as Vesco did. This is especially true when his crimes involved hundreds of millions of dollars and the most powerful people in the world. Some argue that his reach into political circles, from Nixon's inner circle to involvement in shadowy dealings with Cuba and Libya, was no mere chance. They suggest he wasn't simply a rogue financier, but someone whose activities intersected with American covert interests. Supporters of this theory highlight Vesco's connections to figures with CIA backgrounds and his ability to operate freely in countries that were usually hostile to American fugitives. They speculate that Vesco may have acted as an asset, using his wealth and global contacts to open doors, pass along information, or grease diplomatic wheels. While no concrete evidence has ever surfaced proving such a relationship, it does explain how a working-class kid from Detroit could spend his entire life apparently evading the authorities. As thunder rolled over the waves of Lake Michigan in September 1679, a pioneering ship named Le Griffon vanished into history. This was no ordinary vessel. It was the first full-sized sailing ship ever to ply the upper Great Lakes, built by the ambitious French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle. Loaded with valuable furs and a crew of 6 for her return journey, Le Griffon set out from a remote island trading post with a favorable wind, only to disappear without a trace. In the blink of an eye, the Great Lakes' first great ship became its first great mystery. For more than 3 centuries since, historians, divers, and dreamers have wondered what happened to Le Griffon. After all, a 45-ton bark, armed with cannons, vanishing without a trace in the wilderness of the Great Lakes, is a highly unusual event. La Salle was a man with a plan, and in the late 1670s, this French explorer envisioned establishing a fur trade empire and finding a water route to China via the elusive Northwest Passage. To achieve these ambitious goals, he needed more than canoes. He needed a ship to navigate the Great Lakes and carry large cargoes of pelts and supplies. So, in 1679, deep in the Niagara wilderness above the falls, La Salle oversaw the construction of a 45-ton vessel he christened Le Griffon. And yeah, I'm going to let you take an educated guess as to what mythical creature he named the ship after. Built from local timber and fitted with 7 cannons, it was by far the largest ship the region had ever seen, astonishing the Native American tribes who watched this fortress take shape. La Salle launched Le Griffon on the upper Niagara River in the summer of 1679, marking the beginning of the end of the dominance of canoes in the Great Lakes. His ship, the first of its kind to sail beyond Niagara Falls, embarked with a crew of 32 men and a Jesuit priest, Father Louis Hennepin, aboard as chronicler. They traversed Lake Erie, navigated up the Detroit and St. Clair rivers into Lake Huron, and pressed onward into the uncharted waters of Lake Michigan. By the time Le Griffon reached the far end of Lake Michigan, it had proved that large vessels could operate in these waters, eventually paving the way for future ships and settlements in the region. La Salle's expedition reached its furthest point at a small island at the entrance of Green Bay on Lake Michigan in early September 1679. There, the French crew met with the Potawatomi people who had amassed a huge stockpile of pelts in anticipation of Le Griffon's arrival. La Salle decided to continue exploring inland, but he sent Le Griffon back east to deliver the valuable cargo. On September 18th, 1679, after riding out a gale for 4 days at anchor, the ship's pilot and 5 crew set sail from the island bound for the Niagara River. The ship was loaded down with an estimated 12,000 pounds of furs, an amount that was intended to pay off La Salle's massive debts. As La Salle watched her disappear over the horizon, he never imagined it would be the last time he saw his groundbreaking ship. Not long after leaving the sheltered harbor, Le Griffon sailed straight into a brewing storm over Lake Michigan. Local Potawatomi observers had warned the crew that a storm was coming and urged them not to depart. According to legend, the crew informed them that, quote, "A griffin does not fear the wind," a quote which was almost certainly added later for dramatic flair. Once out in open water, legend claims that the vessel met the full fury of the gale. Father Hennepin, the Jesuit priest, later wrote that the ship was tossed by violent winds and then simply vanished, possibly swallowed by the waves. However, he wasn't a personal witness to the event, and his source appears to be his own speculation combined with the accounts of native witnesses. These witnesses didn't actually see what happened to the ship, however, but rather, at best, they saw it leave in a storm. La Salle, waiting in vain for his ship's return, realized by late November that it was hopelessly overdue and likely lost. According to some accounts, he sent out a search party which found scraps of wreckage from a wooden ship. Given that his ship was the only old-world European-style sailing ship in that part of the Great Lakes ever, if this account is true, this confirmed his worst fears. The sudden disappearance of Le Griffon spawned countless theories. With no survivors to tell the tale, people filled the void with speculation. The most notable theory is that it simply sank in a storm, and there's some circumstantial evidence to support this. However, La Salle himself began to believe that something entirely different happened. La Salle grew convinced that his ship didn't sink by accident but was sabotaged. In a 1683 letter, he expressed his belief that the Griffin's pilot and crew might have intentionally scuttled the ship and ran off with the furs. According to this theory, the mutineers' plan unraveled when they were allegedly captured by native bands before they could get far. However, no concrete proof of a mutiny ever emerged, and La Salle himself would perish a few years later before the matter could be fully investigated. Another story claims that a band of warriors of the Ottawa tribe boarded the Griffin at anchor, eliminated the crew, looted the cargo, and burned the ship. This tale was recorded years later by a French missionary, but based on hearsay, and even he doubted its veracity. This missionary may have believed that the man who was telling him this story was trying to win French support against the Ottawa for secondary gain. That is to say, the French missionary thought that this individual was simply making the story up to further his own cause, or the cause of his tribe. No direct evidence has ever surfaced that any tribe attacked the ship, and no native oral histories have been connected to such an incident. Notably, if the incident did occur and these warriors were able to get their hands on 12,000 pounds of furs, this story would almost certainly have been repeated for generations. Despite these tales, no conclusive evidence has ever emerged to pinpoint Le Griffon's exact fate. The ship's end remains an open question, though most scholars still lean toward the storm on Lake Michigan as the most plausible culprit. The ship's elusive wreck has become legendary among shipwreck hunters. Since the 19th century, over 20 claims have surfaced from various corners of Lakes Michigan and Huron, each purporting to have found the long-lost vessel. Old timbers on a beach here, a mysterious hull there, yet each time, inspection proved it was another ship or lacked any definitive link to La Salle's ship. Searchers have continued to hunt for the ship up until the present day, though no site has ever been definitively linked to the wreck. It was a damp, foggy August morning in 1975 when a father and son set out early for a simple fishing trip on Sherman Lake in Newcastle, Maine. The serenity of the water was shattered by a gruesome discovery. At about 8 o'clock, as they prepared to cast their lines, the two fishermen noticed something floating near a bridge. Upon further investigation, they discovered the body of a young woman. The horrified pair ran to a nearby farmhouse to call the police, initially reporting what they assumed was a drowning. But as officers arrived, it became clear this was no accident, but rather the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Maine for decades. A Lincoln County deputy sheriff was first on the scene on that August 16, 1975 morning. He noticed potential signs of foul play and secured the area, then called in the Maine State Police from Augusta. By the time state detectives arrived, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered in shock along the road. The victim's body was found face down by the water's edge, arms outstretched and hair fanned across the shallow lake. She was mostly clothed, and she still wore some jewelry, including a silver bracelet and a small pendant. However, despite these identifying features, no ID was found with her, so her name remained a mystery at the time. As officers pulled the body from the water, the cause of death became grimly apparent. A dark ligature mark encircled her neck, and bruises were visible all over her body. The state medical examiner determined she had been in the water less than 24 hours, suggesting the slaying likely occurred the night before. The perp had made little effort to conceal the crime scene, and the young woman had simply been dumped in the lake. In the days after the discovery, the victim still had no name. Investigators canvassed the area, interviewing locals and checking with hotels, campsites, and police agencies for any missing person matching her description. Some even theorized she might have been a seasonal waitress or other summer worker passing through. Despite these efforts, no one could identify the young woman. Growing desperate, authorities took a very rare step. They released a post-mortem photograph of her face to the media and asked them to broadcast it on the local news and put it in papers. Remarkably, this gamble paid off very quickly. This photograph was published in a Boston newspaper and caught the attention of a family in Massachusetts who immediately recognized the woman. 10 days after the body was found, the young woman was finally identified as 19-year-old Florence Lowes of Brockton, Massachusetts. Investigators confirmed the identification through photographs, dental records, and jewelry she had been wearing. Florence's family hadn't even realized she was missing at the time. Her mother had spoken with her only about a week before the tragedy, so no missing person report had ever been filed. Florence was recently divorced from her marriage to Richard Paul Lowes and had moved back to Brockton, where she was living with a roommate. She had worked as a nurse's aide, but by that summer she was between jobs. Importantly, Florence had strong ties to Maine, and her father lived in the area near where her body was found. Investigators learned that on August 15, 1975, Florence left Brockton intending to travel north to visit him. With no car, she likely hitchhiked the roughly 150-mile journey. Sherman Lake lies just off U.S. Route 1, a major coastal highway, so the hitchhiking theory neatly explained how a Massachusetts traveler could end up there. Tragically, Florence never made it to her father's house. At some point on her journey, she crossed paths with the perpetrator. Once Florence's identity was known, law enforcement in both Maine and Massachusetts retraced her steps and searched for suspects. Maine State Police detectives teamed up with Brockton Police and Massachusetts State Police, following leads in both states. Investigators interviewed people in Brockton who had seen Florence before she left, hoping to learn if she mentioned any travel plans or companions. They looked at everyone in her life, including her estranged husband, for anyone with a possible motive. Initial news reports even indicated that detectives had a few promising leads in Massachusetts. Despite this early momentum, no perpetrator was ever identified. By September 1975, officials acknowledged that the investigation had stalled with no new developments. By 1977, 2 years after the crime, police admitted they were still no closer to an explanation than on the day Florence's body was found. Over the years, several theories have surfaced about what happened to Florence Lowes. The most widely held belief is that she fell prey to a dangerous stranger while hitchhiking. Accepting a ride from the wrong person carried obvious risks, and many suspect that Florence was picked up by someone who then turned violent. Her state of undress suggested a possible indecent assault, though the autopsy couldn't prove it one way or the other. Perhaps a passing motorist or truck driver offered her a ride, then assaulted her before dumping her body. If Florence was slain by a random predator, possibly even a serial offender, solving the case would be incredibly difficult. Further, there's no indication that there was any biological evidence of any kind from the offender left at the scene. Given that this was well before the era of the forensic usage of DNA, it's possible that such evidence simply wasn't even collected. While the very obvious and blatant forms of biological evidence did tend to be collected at this time, less obvious forms often didn't. For instance, if there were skin cells from the perpetrator under Florence's nails, this likely would have gone unnoticed at the time. Another theory is that the attacker wasn't an out-of-towner at all, but someone who knew the local area, or even knew Florence personally. Locals noted that a stranger unfamiliar with Newcastle might not easily find the desolate location where she was dumped, especially in the dark. This fuels suspicion that whoever left her body there knew the area well. Indeed, rumors in Newcastle have long speculated that a local person was responsible. Perhaps Florence accepted a ride from someone she thought she could trust, maybe even an acquaintance, who then betrayed her in the worst way. Investigators have never publicly identified a suspect, and no evidence has confirmed this local perpetrator theory. Still, the idea lingers, leaving many to wonder if the perp was closer to home than anyone realized. Decades later, Florence's slaying remains unsolved, with seemingly little to go on. The case remains open, and Maine's Cold Case Unit continues to review it periodically in hopes of a breakthrough. Unfortunately, we're now 50 years out from this horrific tragedy, and as time ticks by, it becomes less and less likely that the perpetrator will ever face justice. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with the usual reminder to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Also, I've just launched the Lazy Chill History video podcast, where I'm slowly rolling out all my content from my history channel. I've included the link in the description, so make sure to like and follow over there as well. On a cold Friday night in February 2000, 20-year-old Angus Shanahan, who went by Gussie, walked out of a Limerick pub and vanished into the darkness without a trace. He left behind a half-finished bottle of beer on a doorstep and stepped into a narrow laneway, appearing to vanish into thin air. What began as an ordinary evening out quickly transformed into one of Ireland's most baffling missing person cases. It would take 18 years for any trace of Gussie to surface, and even then, the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. This is the story of Gussie Shanahan's disappearance, a night out gone terribly wrong, and the theories that still swirl around a case that remains unsolved. February 11th, 2000 began like any other day for Gussie Shanahan. He finished his shift at the Dell computer plant in Castletroy that afternoon and headed into Limerick City to kick off the weekend. Gussie stopped by the bank where his father worked to repay a small loan and mentioned his plans for the night ahead. He then grabbed a quick bite to eat and met up with two close friends to begin the evening. Also, as a quick aside, Limerick had an incredibly seedy reputation at this time and was known for a significant amount of knifing incidents. My understanding is the reputation of the city hasn't improved much, and it's basically the Glasgow of Ireland, but I digress. The trio headed to Cooper's Bar on St. Joseph Street, a pub near his friend's apartment. They had a couple of drinks, and Gussie was in high spirits, chatting with other patrons. By around 9:30, both of his friends had gone back to their apartment, leaving Gussie at the bar on his own. He lingered a while longer and even tried calling a few other friends to join him, but no one was available at that hour. Sometime close to 10:30, Gussie left the pub alone, and security cameras captured him crossing the street toward his friend's building after leaving the pub. A neighbor sitting in a parked car saw Gussie walk up to the apartment door, raise his hand as if to knock, then hesitate and turn away. He set down the beer bottle he was carrying, put on his jacket, and headed off toward a dimly lit alley. Nobody ever saw him come out the other side of that alley, and that was the last confirmed sighting of him. When the Shanahans hadn't heard from Gussie by the end of that weekend, they grew alarmed. By Monday morning, February 14th, Bob Shanahan checked his son's bank records and saw no activity since Friday. When Gussie also failed to show up for work that day, the family filed a missing person report and alerted the cops, and a full-scale search operation was soon launched in Limerick. Police, family, and volunteers scoured the city and surrounding areas for any sign of the missing young man. They retraced Gussie's last known route through the downtown streets and even searched the River Shannon, fearing he might have ended up in the water. Despite exhaustive efforts, no clues turned up. There were no signs of a struggle in the alley where he was last seen, and none of Gussie's belongings were ever found. For the Shanahan family, the pain of not knowing was immense. Gussie's mother, Nancy, was so heartbroken by her son's disappearance that she suffered a stroke, and she died in 2016 without ever knowing her son's fate. Despite this, Bob and Gussie's siblings vowed to continue the search for Nancy as much as for Gussie. They kept his story in the public eye through media appeals and persisted in contacting anyone who might help. But now, let's step back in time to 2001, because it turns out a John Doe case hadn't been properly connected to Gussie's disappearance. On October 28, 2001, about 20 months after Gussie disappeared, a search team discovered partial skeletal remains on Key Island in the Shannon estuary. A few bone fragments were recovered, but at the time they couldn't be identified. Early DNA tests failed to link the remains to any known missing person, so the fragments were stored as unidentified and largely forgotten. For 17 years, those bones sat in storage while the Shanahans continued to agonize over Gussie's fate. Finally, in late 2018, advancements in DNA technology provided an answer. A re-examination of the Key Island bones matched them to Gussie Shanahan, and in October 2018, the family received official confirmation. In November 2018, the Shanahans were at last able to hold a funeral for Gussie. They laid his remains to rest beside his late mother Nancy, as the family had always hoped to do. This partial closure also prompted law enforcement to take a fresh look at the case. The authorities opened a complete review of the investigation's original files and appealed again for information, treating the case with renewed urgency. After 18 years of painful uncertainty, there was finally a concrete development, but the question of how Gussie ended up in the river remained unanswered. With confirmation of Gussie's death, the focus turned to how it happened. One theory is that his death was a tragic accident. Perhaps Gussie, while walking alone, wandered toward the river and fell in by mistake. However, his family and others doubt this. He was last seen walking away from the water and didn't appear to be overly intoxicated, which makes an abrupt accidental drowning seem unlikely. Moreover, intensive searches along the Shannon at the time found no trace of him, casting doubt on the idea that he simply slipped into the river that night. Likewise, his family noted that Gussie had no personal problems that might have prompted him to do something to himself. The leading theory, which Gussie's family strongly believes, is that he met with foul play. Early on, suspicions arose that he may have crossed paths with dangerous individuals after leaving the pub. Information later emerged, suggesting Gussie might have ended up at a house party or gathering, in the company of people with violent reputations. The family believes something went terribly wrong, perhaps an argument or assault, and that Gussie was slain and his body dumped into the river when the heat cooled down. Over the years, the Shanahans have received tips supporting this theory. In one instance, an anonymous caller told Bob Shanahan that Gussie, quote, ended up in the water that night because he was put there, implying others were responsible. Over the years, there has even been speculation about a broader pattern. Coincidentally, 2 other young men employed at Dell in Limerick vanished in the years around Gussie's disappearance, though there's been no official connection between the cases. To date, no one has been charged in connection with Gussie Shanahan's disappearance, though his family and the authorities continue to cling to the hope that this Irish cold case will be closed. In 1970, a Harvard scientist believed he had witnessed a superhuman feat of memory. A student known as Elizabeth stared at a random pattern of 10,000 dots with one eye, and the next day looked at a second pattern of 10,000 dots with her other eye. Incredibly, her mind fused the 2 images into a single picture, as if she had taken a mental photograph of the first pattern and stored it overnight. This startling result offered a tantalizing glimpse of the concept known as photographic memory. Yet Elizabeth never underwent further tests, and somewhat bizarrely, she married the researcher and slipped out of the spotlight. This left behind a burning question: was her ability real, or just an illusion? Eidetic memory is the ability to vividly recall an image for a brief time after seeing it, almost as if the image were still present. A very small percentage of young children show this ability, describing pictures in detail from memory for a few minutes before it fades. In adults, however, true eidetic imagery is virtually non-existent. One theory suggests that as we develop language and abstract thinking, we lose the raw visual snapshot ability we had as children. However, the popular notion of photographic memory goes beyond eidetic images. It implies permanent and exact recall of visual information, but experts say there's no proof that anyone actually possesses such unlimited visual memory. Scientists have long been skeptical that photographic memory exists. Aside from the Elizabeth story, no scientific study has ever verified a person with long-term photographic recall. Her case was never independently replicated, and after the 1970 publication, Elizabeth refused further testing and married the researcher, which feels like some sort of ethical breach. This very unusual relationship between the researcher and the subject strongly suggested to some scientists that the original researcher was trying to rizz up Lizzie by making her feel unique. Nevertheless, legends of photographic recall persist. For instance, it's said that mathematician John von Neumann could recite entire books from memory, and similar claims have been made about other prodigies. These anecdotes are hard to verify, and even if true, they likely reflect exceptional learning techniques or intense focus, rather than a literal camera-like memory. For instance, individuals are able to memorize and recite very lengthy religious texts from memory without error due to intensive focus, devotion, and repetition. Overall, research shows that human memory doesn't work like a recording device. It's an active, reconstructive process where we assemble pieces of information rather than play back an exact copy. In experiments, even people with excellent memories can't recall a complex image with perfect fidelity once it's out of sight. That said, these people can recognize images they saw before among thousands of new ones with around 80% accuracy. But recognition is much easier than free recall. In fact, scientists believe our brains would likely need a completely different architecture to store exact snapshots of every scene. Some individuals do have astonishing memory abilities, just not the unlimited photographic kind. A handful of people have highly superior autobiographical memory, meaning they can recall almost every day of their lives in vivid detail. A famous case is Jill Price, who can tell you what she was doing on a given date years ago, even describing minor events and the day's weather. Yet even she doesn't have a crystal clear snapshot of every scene, and her gift is limited to personal memories. And she still forgets plenty of information outside her own life story. And I use the term gift here in quite a loose sense, since the idea of being able to remember every moment of your life basically sounds like hell. There are also memory champions who perform jaw-dropping feats like memorizing dozens of decks of cards in minutes. However, they achieve this through practice and clever strategies, not an inherent photographic memory. These mental athletes train to encode information using vivid imagery and patterns, rather than instantly absorbing scenes at a glance. In rare cases of savant syndrome, some people exhibit extraordinary memory in specific areas. For instance, British artist Stephen Wiltshire can draw entire city skylines from memory after a short helicopter ride. These abilities are incredible, but even savants are not photographic in the broad sense. Stephen Wiltshire's memories, for instance, are highly specialized. Despite the lack of hard evidence, the idea of photographic memory refuses to die. It remains a staple of fictional geniuses, something that's attributed to real geniuses, and a topic of fascination for the public. In the end, photographic memories likely don't exist, and the idea as scientific reality likely stems from a very unusual relationship between a researcher and his subject. Imagine you're a traveler in southeastern Kansas in the early 1870s. The country still has the fresh scars of conflict and the promise of a new life, of 160 acres to call your own, has pulled you west. The landscape around you is an immense, unforgiving prairie. It's a lonely expanse where homesteads are scattered like islands in a sea of grass, and your nearest neighbor might be miles away. This is Labette County, a place carved out of land recently ceded by the Osage Nation, a place defined by both boundless opportunity and profound isolation. Your journey follows the Great Osage Trail, a path worn into the earth first by migrating buffalo, then by Native American tribes, and now by the wagons of settlers like yourself. It's a vital artery of westward expansion, but it's also a place of great danger. The weather is harsh and unpredictable, with tornadoes, blizzards, and floods that can erase a homesteader's dreams overnight. Violence is a constant threat, whether from conflicts with displaced tribes or from the battle-hardened American men who now work their way onto the frontier. In this vast emptiness, people simply vanish, and when they disappear, the prairie keeps their secrets. As dusk begins to settle, casting long shadows across the plains, you spot a light. It comes from a small one-room cabin, a welcome sign of life in the desolate landscape. A crude, hand-lettered sign above the door reads, "Groceries." This is the Bender Place, a wayside inn offering the promise of a hot meal, supplies, and most importantly, a safe place to rest for the night. For a weary traveler, it seems like a sanctuary, a fragile outpost of civilization where the unspoken code of frontier hospitality offers a moment of peace. You approach, unaware that the trust you're about to place in these strangers is the last mistake you'll ever make. This humble cabin wasn't a refuge, it was a slaughterhouse, and for at least a dozen travelers, this beacon of hope on this great migratory trail was the end of the line. This is the disturbing story of the Benders, a supposed family of innkeepers who committed horrific actions before performing one of American history's greatest vanishing acts. To understand the horror that unfolded in Labette County, one must first try to understand the perpetrators. But the Bender family itself is an enigma, a collection of four individuals whose true identities, origins, and relationships remain a mystery. They presented themselves as a simple homesteading family, but they were a carefully constructed criminal conspiracy, a human machine where each member played a specific and deadly role. The patriarch, John Bender Sr., was a man of about 60, described by those who met him as a repulsive and brutish figure. He was a giant of a man, with piercing eyes and a sullen, ill-tempered demeanor. Like the other members of this so-called family, he claimed to be from Germany. As with all the members of the family, it remains unclear what their true origins were, as German was commonly spoken across Central and Eastern Europe. And to get in my one mandatory Simpsons reference per video, no one who speaks German could be an evil man, right? His wife, Elvira Bender, was around 55 and equally disliked by her neighbors, who called her a she-devil. Unfriendly and sinister, she was rumored to have slain previous husbands before arriving in Kansas, and she dabbled in folk magic, claiming to be a medium who could cast spells. While she claimed not to understand English, a moment of rage during a confrontation later revealed her command of the language was far better than she let on. The younger generation presented a stark contrast. John Bender Jr., about 25, was handsome and spoke English well, though with a German accent. He had a peculiar habit of laughing without cause, which led many in the community to suspect there was something wrong with him. This perception, whether genuine or an act, made him seem harmless and non-threatening, a perfect disguise for the violence he was capable of. The public face and undisputed star of the operation was Kate Bender. Around 23 years old, she was universally described as beautiful, intelligent, and intensely charismatic. She was fluent in English and was the only member of the family who actively engaged with the surrounding community. Kate was the family's lure, and her chosen bait was spiritualism. In an era when communicating with the dead was a popular and widespread belief, Kate advertised herself as a powerful psychic, healer, and spiritualist medium. She distributed flyers and gave lectures, claiming she could cure blindness and deafness with the laying on of hands, contact the spirits of the deceased, and locate lost possessions. Her lectures also promoted radical ideas like free love, which, while scandalous, only added to her notoriety and drew curious visitors to the family inn. And by curious travelers, I mean men traveling alone who definitely thought they had a chance with this frontier cutie. Kate's persona was the perfect tool for disarming travelers, and she was basically the honeypot that lured victims in. With her charm and supposed supernatural gifts, she could win their trust. This would draw them into intimate conversations where they would reveal their travel plans and, most importantly, their financial situations. The very foundation of this group was built on lies. While they were widely believed to be German immigrants, no official documentation of their origins, or even their real names, has ever been discovered. The name Bender itself, while a fairly common German name, was almost certainly an alias. Even their family ties were likely a complete fabrication. Neighbors reported that the intimacy between John Jr. and Kate seemed more like that of a husband and wife than siblings. The reason for doing this was also a part of their ruse. In a society built on the family unit, the image of a family-run inn offered a veneer of safety and respectability that was crucial to their predatory success. The Benders' genius for evil was not just in their deception, but in their engineering. They transformed their humble, one-room cabin into a highly efficient machine capable of quote-unquote processing guests. The cabin was a simple wooden structure, measuring about 16 by 24 feet. Inside, they had made a simple but critical modification. A large, heavy canvas wagon cover was hung from a rope, splitting the single room in two. The front area was the public face of their operation, a small general store and a dining room where travelers could get a meal. The area behind the curtain was the family's private quarters, but its true purpose was to serve as a blind from which to launch their ambush. Their modus operandi was a chillingly refined process. After Kate identified a suitable victim, usually a man traveling alone with significant money, he would be invited to dinner and given the seat of honor at the table. This seat wasn't a gesture of hospitality, it was a tactical position. It placed the guest with his back directly against the canvas partition, perfectly silhouetting his head for the attacker waiting behind it. As the unsuspecting traveler ate his meal, captivated by Kate's charm and conversation, one of the male benders would slip behind the curtain. At the right moment, the attacker would swing a heavy hammer, striking the victim on the back of the head with crushing force. Beneath the victim's chair, or immediately beside it, was a concealed trapdoor. The stunned or dead man was immediately dropped through the opening into a dark, stone-lined cellar that was 6 feet deep. This allowed for the instant removal of the body from the main room, minimizing mess and the risk of discovery should another guest arrive. The body was then stripped of every valuable before being disposed of. Under the cover of night, the bodies were removed from this subterranean abattoir and buried in the family's 2-acre vegetable garden and apple orchard just north of the cabin. In a particularly macabre detail passed down through local lore, it was said that Elvira Bender used the apples from the trees growing over her victims' graves to bake pies for future travelers. The Benders' reign of terror lasted for nearly 2 years, from May 1871 to the spring of 1873. During that time, they eliminated at least a dozen people, though the true number may be much higher. Their victims were the forgotten travelers of the frontier, men whose disappearances created distant ripples of concern, but no organized alarm until it was far too late. After all, Kate was an expert at finding men who were very far from home, and whose disappearances wouldn't be noticed for months or even years. The case that finally brought an end to the Benders' slaughter began with the disappearance of George Newton Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter Mary Ann in the winter of 1872. A recent widower, Longcore was traveling back to Iowa and was carrying a significant sum of money. When they vanished, Longcore's former neighbor from Independence, a physician named Dr. William York, became concerned and set out to find them in the spring of 1873. Dr. York's search led him along the Osage Trail and inevitably to the Bender Inn, where he, too, disappeared. The attack on Dr. York was the Benders' final overreach. For 2 years, they had preyed on the anonymous and the transient, individuals whose disappearances could be easily dismissed. Dr. York, however, was a prominent man, and more importantly, his brother was Colonel Alexander York, a Kansas state senator. Unlike the families of other victims, Colonel York had the influence, resources, and unwavering determination to mobilize a search and demand answers. In March 1873, Colonel Alexander York arrived at the Benders Inn, methodically retracing his brother's last known movements. During his initial questioning, the family deployed their well-practiced deception. They admitted Dr. York had stopped there, but insisted he'd continued on his way. They casually suggested he might have fallen victim to an attack by a local tribe or by highwaymen, common and convenient explanations for such disappearances. Kate, the master manipulator, pretended to be deeply concerned and offered to hold a séance to contact his spirit, telling the colonel to return another day. She let him know that he needed to come back alone. in what was a brazen attempt to make the investigator their next victim. But Colonel York was not easily fooled, and he sensed a profound evil in the small cabin and left, deeply suspicious. His doubts were confirmed when he learned of another traveler, a woman who had recently fled the inn in terror after Elvira threatened her with a knife. York returned, this time with an armed posse of men that definitely weren't clowning around. The confrontation was tense, and Elvira's subsequent explosion of rage shattered her facade as a simple woman who couldn't speak English. This outburst further solidified Colonel York's conviction that the family was hiding a dark secret, but in the end, nothing happened yet. As York's investigation intensified, the wider community, already on edge from the string of disappearances, reached a breaking point. A town meeting was convened where dozens of local men gathered to decide on a course of action. They resolved to obtain a warrant and conduct a search of every single homestead in the township. In an act of astonishing audacity, the Bender men were also present at that meeting. They sat among their neighbors, listening as the community organized the very search that would inevitably unearth the bodies buried in their own garden. It was a final, desperate gamble to appear innocent, an attempt to deflect suspicion that was doomed to fail. The Benders knew the moment the vote was taken that their time was up. They could perhaps deceive a lone questioner, but they couldn't survive a systematic, official search of their property. Sometime in the days following the meeting, under the cover of the vast Kansas night, they packed what they could, abandoned their homestead, and vanished. Their escape was discovered a few days later when a neighbor noticed their farm animals were starving and the inn was eerily silent. Unfortunately, a spell of bad weather delayed a formal investigation, giving the Benders a crucial head start of nearly a month to disappear into the American frontier. When the search party finally forced their way into the abandoned Bender cabin in early May 1873, they were met with a scene of hurried departure and an overpowering stench of death. The source of the odor was quickly traced to a trap door under a bed, which had been nailed shut. After prying it open, they peered down into the stone-lined cellar. The pit was empty of bodies, but the floor was caked with so much clotted blood that it had soaked deep into the earth below, irrefutable proof that this had been a place of slaughter. The search then moved outside to the family's small apple orchard and vegetable garden. The ground in the orchard was soft and appeared to have been recently disturbed. The men began to probe the soil, and it wasn't long before they made their first horrific discovery, the body of Dr. William York, buried in a shallow grave. The news spread, and a full-scale excavation began. Over the next day, the searchers unearthed a graveyard. One by one, they uncovered the remains of at least 10 more people, including George Longcore and his infant daughter. The story of the Benders' House of Horrors became a national sensation. Newspapers from New York to Chicago sent reporters to the remote Kansas prairie, and their lurid accounts of the Devil's Kitchen captivated the public. These accounts took the already horrific realities and added new fictionalized elements in an effort to sell more papers. After fleeing their farm, the Benders' trail quickly went cold. Investigators found their abandoned wagon near the town of Thayer, just 12 miles to the north. But from there, the trail vanished completely. A massive manhunt was launched, and the Kansas governor offered a $2,000 reward, a fortune at the time, for information leading to their capture. What happened to the Benders remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Old West, a narrative vacuum that has been filled with two powerful and competing theories. The first is that they simply got away. In the vast, unmapped expanse of 19th century America, it was entirely possible for 4 people to change their names, split up, and begin new lives without a trace. This theory is bolstered by the numerous false sightings and wrongful arrests that plagued investigators for decades. In 1880, a couple in Nebraska was arrested and even confessed, but they were soon exposed as imposters. In 1889, two women were arrested in Michigan and extradited to Kansas on suspicion of being Elvira and Kate, only to be exonerated when their alibis proved solid. These incidents reflect a public desperate for closure, but they also highlight how easily the fugitives could have blended back into society, either in America or elsewhere. The second, more pervasive theory is that the Benders met a swift and brutal end at the hands of a vigilante posse. According to this version of events, a group of enraged neighbors caught up with the family shortly after they fled. They dispensed their own form of frontier justice, forcing confessions from the Benders before eliminating them. While no physical evidence supports this story, it aligns with the harsh realities of the frontier, where communities often took the law into their own hands when official channels failed. The secrecy of such an extrajudicial act would neatly explain why no one ever came forward to claim the substantial reward. Today, more than 150 years later, the search for answers continues, and who the Benders were and what happened to them remains a historical, unsolved mystery.